Chapter 25. With respect to critical difficulties and their solutions, the number and nature of the sources from which they may be drawn may be thus exhibited. The poet, being an imitator, like a painter or any other artist, must of necessity imitate one of three objects: things as they were or are, things as they are said or thought to be, or things as they ought to be. The vehicle of expression is language, either current terms or, it may be, rare words or metaphors. There are also many modifications of language, which we concede to the poets. Add to this, that the standard of correctness is not the same in poetry and politics, any more than in poetry and any other art. Within the art of poetry itself there are two kinds of faults, those which touch its essence, and those which are accidental. If a poet has chosen to imitate something, but has imitated it incorrectly, through want of capacity, the error is inherent in the poetry. But if the failure is due to a wrong choice, if he has represented a horse as throwing out both his off legs at once, or introduced technical inaccuracies in medicine, for example, or in any other art, the error is not essential to the poetry. These are the points of view from which we should consider and answer the objections raised by the critics. First, as to matters which concern the poet's own art. If he describes the impossible, he is guilty of an error, but the error may be justified, if the end of the art be thereby attained, the end being that already mentioned, if, that is, the effect of this or any other part of the poem is thus rendered more striking. A case in point is the pursuit of Hector. If, however, the end might have been as well, or better, attained without violating the special rules of the poetic art, the error is not justified, for every kind of error should, if possible, be avoided. Again, does the error touch the essentials of the poetic art, or some accident of it? For example, not to know that a hind has no horns is a less serious matter than to paint it inartistically. Further, if it be objected that the description is not true to fact, the poet may perhaps reply, but the objects are as they ought to be, just as Sophocles said that he drew men as they ought to be, Euripides as they are. In this way the objection may be met. If, however, the representation be of neither kind, the poet may answer, this is how men say the thing is. This applies to tales about the gods. It may well be that these stories are not higher than fact nor yet true to fact. They are, very possibly, what Xenophanes says of them. But anyhow, this is what is said. Again, a description may be no better than the fact. Still, it was the fact, as in the passage about the arms, upright upon their butt ends stood the spears. This was the custom then, as it now is among the Illyrians. Again, in examining whether what has been said or done by someone is poetically right or not, we must not look merely to the particular act or saying, and ask whether it is poetically good or bad. We must also consider by whom it is said or done, to whom, when, by what means, or for what end, whether, for instance, it be to secure a greater good, or avert a greater evil. Other difficulties may be resolved by due regard to the usage of language. We may note a rare word, as in omicron upsilon rho eta alpha sigma / mu epsilon nu / pi rho omega tau omicron nu, where the poet perhaps employs omicron upsilon rho eta alpha sigma, not in the sense of mules, but of sentinels. So, again, of Dolon, ill-favored indeed he was to look upon. It is not meant that his body was ill-shaped, but that his face was ugly, for the Cretans use the word epsilon iota delta epsilon sigma, well-favored, to denote a fair face. Again, zeta omega rho omicron tau epsilon rho omicron nu / delta epsilon / kappa epsilon rho alpha iota epsilon, mix the drink livelier, does not mean mix it stronger, as for hard drinkers, but mix it quicker. Sometimes an expression is metaphorical, as now all gods and men were sleeping through the night, while at the same time the poet says, often indeed as he turned his gaze to the Trojan plain, he marveled at the sound of flutes and pipes. All is here used metaphorically for many, all being a species of many. So in the verse, alone she hath no part, omicron iota eta alone is metaphorical, for the best known may be called the only one. Again, the solution may depend upon accent or breathing. Thus Hippias of Thassos solved the difficulties in the lines delta iota delta omicron mu epsilon nu, delta iota delta omicron mu epsilon nu, delta epsilon slash omicron iota, and tau omicron slash mu epsilon nu slash omicron upsilon, kappa alpha tau alpha pi upsilon theta epsilon tau alpha iota slash omicron mu beta rho omega. Or again, the question may be solved by punctuation, as in Empedocles, of a sudden things became mortal that before had learnt to be immortal, and things unmixed before mixed.
Oragain b ambiguity of meaning as bialpar ho omega eta kappa epsilon nu delta epsilon bilambda epsilon omega nu upsilon xi verede word bilambda epsilon omega is ambiguous.
Or by the usage of language. Thus any mixed drink is called omicron iota nu omicron sigma, wine. Hence Ganymede is said to pour the wine to Zeus, though the gods do not drink wine. So two workers in iron are called chi alpha lambda kappa epsilon alpha sigma, or workers in bronze. This, however, may also be taken as a metaphor. Again, when a word seems to involve some inconsistency of meaning, we should consider how many senses it may bear in the particular passage. For example, there was stayed the spear of bronze, we should ask in how many ways we may take being checked there. The true mode of interpretation is the precise opposite of what Glaucon mentions. Critics, he says, jump at certain groundless conclusions. They pass adverse judgment and then proceed to reason on it, and, assuming that the poet has said whatever they happen to think, find fault if a thing is inconsistent with their own fancy. The question about Icarius has been treated in this fashion. The critics imagine he was a Lacedaemonian. They think it strange, therefore, that Telemachus should not have met him when he went to Lacedaemon. But the Cephalenian story may perhaps be the true one. They allege that Odysseus took a wife from among themselves, and that her father was Icadius, not Icarius. It is merely a mistake, then, that gives plausibility to the objection. In general, the impossible must be justified by reference to artistic requirements, or to the higher reality, or to received opinion. With respect to the requirements of art, a probable impossibility is to be preferred to a thing improbable and yet possible. Again, it may be impossible that there should be men such as Zeuxis painted. Yes, we say, but the impossible is the higher thing, for the ideal type must surpass the reality. To justify the irrational, we appeal to what is commonly said to be. In addition to which, we urge that the irrational sometimes does not violate reason, just as it is probable that a thing may happen contrary to probability. Things that sound contradictory should be examined by the same rules as in dialectical refutation, whether the same thing is meant, in the same relation and in the same sense. We should therefore solve the question by reference to what the poet says himself, or to what is tacitly assumed by a person of intelligence. The element of the irrational, and, similarly, depravity of character, are justly censured when there is no inner necessity for introducing them. Such is the irrational element in the introduction of Aegeus by Euripides and the badness of Menelaus in the Orestes. Thus, there are 5 sources from which critical objections are drawn. Things are censured either as impossible, or irrational, or morally hurtful, or contradictory, or contrary to artistic correctness. The answers should be sought under the 12 heads above mentioned.
Summary and reflection for Chapter 25.
In Section 25 of the Poetics, Aristotle addresses critical difficulties faced by poets and outlines various sources from which objections arise. He identifies 3 objects that poets may imitate: things as they were or are, things as they are said or thought to be, or things as they ought to be. The vehicle of expression is language, encompassing current terms, rare words, and metaphors. Aristotle distinguishes between faults in poetry, categorizing them as either inherent to the art or accidental. Inherent faults occur when a poet imitates something incorrectly due to a lack of capacity. Accidental faults arise from a wrong choice, such as representing something inaccurately due to misinformation in other domains like medicine or any other art. The poet's choice to describe the impossible is discussed. Aristotle argues that such errors may be justified if they enhance the overall effect of the poem. He introduces examples like the pursuit of Hector to illustrate this point. However, Errors that could be avoided without violating the rules of poetic art are deemed unjustified. The analysis extends to examining whether an error touches the essence or an accident of poetic art, as well as considering whether the representation aligns with how things are said, thought to be, or ought to be. The poet's justification may rely on the metaphorical use of language, ambiguity, accent, breathing, punctuation, or the usage of language. Aristotle emphasizes the importance of considering who says or does something, to whom, when, by what means, and for what end. Additionally, he mentions that critics often make errors by jumping to conclusions and then reasoning based on their assumptions. The scholar also provides guidance on resolving difficulties by referring to the artistic requirements, higher reality, received opinion, or the poet's own words. He tackles the notions of the impossible, the irrational, and contradictory elements, suggesting that they can be justified under certain circumstances. Aristotle concludes by categorizing critical objections into 5 types: the impossible, the irrational, the morally hurtful, the contradictory, and deviations from artistic correctness. He urges critics to consider the context and nature of the objections and provides 12 heads under which answers to these objections can be sought.
Practical exercises.
Writers. Imitating the impossible. Write a short narrative that includes an element considered impossible, justifying its inclusion by enhancing the overall impact of the piece. Exploring metaphorical language. Craft a story using metaphorical language, experimenting with how it influences the interpretation of events and characters. Composers. Musical interpretation of ambiguity. Compose a musical piece that reflects ambiguity, using elements like varying tempo or tonality to convey different meanings. Expressive composition with punctuation. Create a musical composition inspired by punctuation, using pauses or changes in rhythm to emphasize specific elements in the piece. Dancers. Choreographing the irrational. Develop a dance piece that includes movements considered irrational, justifying their inclusion to enhance the artistic expression. Interpretation through movement. Choreograph a dance that interprets a poem or story, focusing on movements that align with metaphorical language and ambiguity. Actors. Acting the contradictory. Perform a scene with elements that seem contradictory, aiming to convey the complexity and depth of the characters and their actions. Character interpretation through language. Act out a scene, paying attention to how the choice of language influences the perception of characters and events. These exercises encourage artists to engage with Aristotle's insights on the challenges faced by poets, exploring the boundaries of possibility, the use of metaphorical language, and the interpretation of ambiguity within their respective art forms.